January 8th, 2026. Russia is in its fourth year of war with Ukraine, and today we review the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we begin in the Kharkiv region, more precisely in the city of Kupyansk. There are new Ukrainian recordings from there that show most of the town, including the center, is once again under Ukrainian control. The footage was released by the Ukrainian army, and we can see Kupyansk's central market, where Ukrainian soldiers are basically moving from house to house. That's an extremely dangerous task they're carrying out, because from the helmet cam footage you can see you have to be ready all the time. The Ukrainians keep constantly pointing their weapons, their guns in that direction, basically staying alert for any sudden threat or movement, where they suspect possible Russian counterattacks or any remaining Russian soldiers. What's interesting here now is that the Ukrainians are moving inside this market. We'll look at it on the map in a moment, in the center of Kupyansk, and they're not finding Russian soldiers here, but rather so-called waiters, people who stay in Ukraine, remain in the destroyed towns and wait there day after day, patiently awaiting the arrival of the Russian soldiers. Depending on the city and region, that's at most about 1 to 5% of the local population overall. So people who are so blinded by Russian propaganda that they say, yeah, we're being shelled every day, but we're still holding out for better times. When Russians arrive, everything will be better. These waiting people, soldiers found one here. He's a man who pretty much still sleeps in the rubble right here in the city center, or rather actually lives here. We'll blur the whole thing, of course. And this man, according to the Ukrainians, supposedly snitched on him here. So he's supposed to have given away the Ukrainians' coordinates, like radioed the Russians to tell them exactly where the Ukrainian defenders are moving when they try to reposition themselves to get back into town. And so it's quite possible the man was arrested here, according to local reports. We'll see. They're not set up here to be quite as extreme as when you run into Russian soldiers. They can clearly see he's unarmed. The rifle keeps getting lowered every now and then. So that means here. The difficulty, or how serious the situation is kind of middling, I'd say. In the video, which runs a few minutes longer, we see that several of these people waiting here are then found. They're encountered, and according to the Ukrainian army, were also arrested. So the situation in Kupyansk is basically that we're in the city center, and we can take a look at that on the next map now. There are Ukrainian soldiers there who are trying to clear out the last Russian remnants, or the remnants of the Russian occupation from about a month or two ago, and secure the area. And sometimes they run into not just Russian soldiers, but also collaborators with the Russian army. We can see the whole area is now shaded blue. It had all been occupied by the Russians before. In 2022, the Ukrainian army freed the eastern part here. These areas we see around Kupyansk had been under Russian control for a time. But you can see it now. There are still 3 small islands of Russian control, as clearly shown on the deep state map, our map provider. What we just saw was footage from the city center, right here on the main street, just a short walk away from this spot. You can also clearly see the bridge spanning the Oskil River. You can clearly make out the Oskil itself, the river running right through the town. From these geolocated shots, we could pretty clearly see that Ukraine has by now, once again, entered the center of Kupyansk. So the Russian claims that they're advancing there still stand. And Putin's claims that the Ukrainians and even President Zelensky were only spreading propaganda when they said Kupyansk had been recaptured. These recordings prove that too. It's just Russian propaganda. We want to look at footage from Kupyansk that shows the town from above, so you can see what it looks like now and judge for yourselves. And this footage is pretty sobering once again. There were about 26,000 people living in Kupyansk at least a few years ago, according to the most recent estimates publicly available. Of course, the numbers have steadily dwindled as a direct result of the Russian attacks and the destruction here. But Kupyansk was completely destroyed in recent months when the Russian army pushed into the town with very heavy fire, as they always do, leaving nearly the whole town in ruins and almost nothing intact. And as I said, these are very recent shots from the last few days. You can also tell by the weather, as it shows us that. Of the 26,000 residents, as we just saw, maybe a few dozen are still here who are waiting for the Russians who want to become part of Russia. The vast majority, as I said earlier, between 95 and 99% of the population are fleeing the Russian aggressors because they don't just want to control their city, they want to occupy and permanently dominate it. Partly want to make it part of Russia, but also because they very often first completely destroy the city. And these are unfortunately shots that look very similar to what we've also seen from other cities over the past few days, like Pokrovsk and other cities in parts of eastern Ukraine. And Russia is now trying different ways to push further into Kharkiv to also capture Kupyansk. We had that very dangerous maneuver, as we can take a look at it on the map, as described over the past few weeks, that crossing of the eastern salient, that front river, and then the subsequent advance on the far bank, pushing further inland. That whole flanking move didn't really work, so they're coming up with new ideas and fresh attempts to take that particular part of Kharkiv firmly under their own control and hold it. And one of them has been happened here at Novoplatonivka over the past few days. So the Russians once again tried to use a gas pipeline, actually an old one, to move through it to infiltrate enemy lines and then pop out somewhere and launch sudden attacks on the Ukrainians in their own rear, striking them there unexpectedly. As I said, the footage we're about to see comes from Novoplatonivka. What we see in the Ukrainian army's footage is that the Russians have a big problem, because the Ukrainians watched it all and knew where the Russians came out, coming out of the pipeline, and adjusted their artillery to intercept them right here now. We're looking at the footage. Much of it we had to pixelate, much because you can actually see those Russian soldiers on the thermal images, clearly visible and moving in groups. That's about 10, maybe 15 soldiers. They all die over the course of the video. We can try to present this a bit more clearly. So here you see the output, that'll pop up in a moment in Ukrainian, the output of this pipeline, which apparently is coming from the east. And the Russian soldiers accordingly then gather here. They're assembling right here precisely for the next attack in this area of Kharkiv, as can clearly be seen on the map. We can also see right away that the Ukrainians were pretty quick to get a handle on the whole situation. Now you can see the artillery fire here that was then unleashed really massively on those soldiers right over there. I'll just step aside briefly so you can see better that we really have a lot of impacts. We can take another look. So here, basically the same starting point as before. Here you can see the soldiers who just gathered together in one spot. So here, basically the exit was just from this pipe, and the impacts were all around them, to the left and right. First, we would use artillery, since it's relatively quick to get going if you know where the enemy is, because within seconds you can pretty much put down up to 20 rounds. Can cross 30 kilometers to attack here. But the Ukrainians, of course, typical of the past few years, immediately send in kamikaze drones. We see the different approach angles as at least 6. Whether they're sequential or simultaneous, we can't say. Anyway, they all targeted the survivors of that artillery strike, those who had come out of the gas pipe. And now we see the really devastating attacks one after another. From the thermal view above, you can also see that there are more and more. I think we don't need to mark it exactly. You can see it. We've pixelated it all over. Those are the 10, 12 soldiers we just saw who are dropping one after another here, or who got hit and then die there. So that means the Russians are trying once again. We already saw that, for example, in Avdiivka last year. We had it in Sucha. We also saw last year that these gas pipelines were being used by the Russian army to get behind the Ukrainian lines. That often worked. In this case, it doesn't work at all, because we can see that a Russian attack, an ambush set up using a gas pipeline here near Kupyansk, was wiped out by Ukrainian artillery and drone forces and was decisively destroyed before it could achieve any objectives. From Kharkiv, we go to Donetsk in the east. We want to take another look at the situation in Pokrovsk. And these are new clips we get daily of Russian invaders moving around in Pokrovsk. They're trying to push further north and west from there, but very often they're already being stopped en route by Ukrainian drones, which halt their movement before they get any farther. You can see these shots from the last few days, the heavily snow-covered landscapes in Pokrovsk itself, the former town of about 65,000. And we can see that in places the Russians are moving on motorcycles, and in other places they're steadily advancing on foot. And time and again, it's just nonsense being used. I think we'll see it again in a moment. There you can see different vehicles, civilian vehicles, even ATV and some military vehicles that are at least being used by the Russians, and then, however, end up getting attacked. Here we again see the city's canyon-like streets. As I said, it had 65,000 residents. Now it's estimated about 1,000 so-called waiting people still live here, who basically now want to live here under Russian occupation, but the whole thing is extremely difficult. Tanks are rare, and so are IFVs in Pokrovsk. They're even more reluctant to bring those into the city. Instead, it's mainly small quads, here we can see them, that are being attacked by Ukraine. I think at the end you can see a really big group, if I'm not mistaken, of quads. Those are individual soldiers moving now, and I think we'll actually see that toward the very end. Here you can see basically 3 vehicles coming around the corner, 1, 2, 3. And the Ukrainian drone, specifically a fiber optic drone, which we can see pretty clearly, it can fly very low and still get a very clear picture. And this fiber optic drone now dives down onto this small column here and consequently hits the first of these quad vehicles. The situation, we'll take a look at it on the map, remains relatively stable in Pokrovsk. You wouldn't have thought that a few weeks ago, because the Russians had overrun the town and had already quickly seized large parts of it, surprisingly so. But the footage we all just saw, as I said, comes directly from that location, from the ruins of Pokrovsk, which very often means it's these big roads here that run from the south up toward the northwest, either toward Kharkiv or toward the N32. That highway heading toward Dnipropetrovsk, where the Russians keep trying to push forward to carry out the attacks we just saw. which, however, are for the most part being stopped. We can also see by now, and as we talked about for a long time, Monograd was for a long time almost encircled. And there the Russians had also called on roughly 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers to surrender because they were supposedly encircled. We kept saying that there was indeed an encirclement on the ground, but they had full control over this area here via this corridor that leads out of Mirnorod. But according to our information, almost all the Ukrainian soldiers managed to get out of Mirnorod. So that means there weren't any mass arrests by the Russian army there either, and as I said, the area stayed unchanged. We hadn't marked it yet, then we marked it orange, and now we've marked it red. That means it's under Russian control, yes, except for only a few small parts of the city. However, even here, the Ukrainians have pretty much managed to withdraw successfully. If you're going to lose this former town of 41,000 people, at least don't end up being taken prisoner en masse. Next, we're going to look at two, yes, I'd call them tragic scenes from the war from the last few days. One is tragic for the Ukrainians, the other for the Russians, but it shows just how much chance and how many nearly last-minute split-second decisions in this war ultimately decide soldiers' lives and deaths. First, we're looking at Russian footage, specifically footage from a special unit dedicated to drone attack operations. This unit has spotted a Ukrainian DJI-30T drone here. It's basically just sitting there, still idle. At first, they only spotted the drone, at least that's the official propaganda, and then they tried to attack that drone lying there in the snow. So we can clearly see that now. That means they sent a kamikaze drone, a fiber optic guided one, to attack this DJI-30T here that was getting ready to take off imminently. Interestingly, at the moment you're here, you can see it here, they recognized the actual target and thought, oh, there are more drones around them right now indeed. So that means this is apparently a position here that the Ukrainians had prepared as well, where the Ukrainians set up the launch, not just the drone, the DJI drone just now, but they also prepared the launch for the FPV kamikaze drone, which you can clearly see set up here. So the battery's already on, the warhead's attached. That means the whole thing should basically launch together as a pair in tandem to hit the Russian position. However, a big problem for the Ukrainians, the Russians have already spotted it. We can see now that the Ukrainians are trying at the last moment to ram the Russian drone, basically shoot it down by briefly climbing up here with their armed drone. They missed the Russian one at first. However, it now appears that the impact sensor is working correctly and is triggering on impact exactly as it was designed to do. We're about to have an explosion we don't see here, but we can see the Russians at that moment have to cut it off. So the video ends, which most likely leads us to the conclusion that this bomb attached here exploded and accordingly the Russian drone was destroyed, apparently irreparably. The Russians ramp it up pretty cleverly, now flying back in toward it, trying to make it look like the whole thing went off very successfully, and now we see that they actually pulled it off to attack this bunker here. You could already see it in the background, so now they're flying in toward it and trying, after they've hit that DJI, to press the attack and actually finish the job completely. After they've hit the FPV drone, they then go on to attack those Ukrainian soldiers who are probably in this very bunker right there. And it's also pretty interesting to see from different angles that we've got these fires burning quite clearly. Some of the drones don't seem to explode at all, while others just trigger a fire. We don't know if there are still Ukrainians in this position here. It could also be, we shouldn't forget, these runs are pretty quick, but there's always about 10 minutes between each drone that arrive here. So if we've just seen several drones strike here one after another, then there's always 10, 20, 30 minutes that the Ukrainians have. Kind of force them to abandon the position. In the end, the Russians want to show that after flying in here with 3 or 4 drones, there's also some firing. You can see them flying in again from above. Also interesting, the first drone just stops. We didn't see any impact at all, and now here comes the next one. The Russians edit it like it's all a big success, and now we see the huge explosion from above. Here we see it during the fly-in. That means a lot of explosives were used. Again, whether Ukrainians were there or not, we don't know. In any case, that's what we know. Because of this strange situation, you see something, then you see something else, and then you're able to clarify what's going on down here and attack accordingly. That the Russians managed to, well, at least take out the drones here, if not even the position, and in the worst case, kill the Ukrainian soldiers here. Another situation shows us how quickly the tide can suddenly turn around in the war in Ukraine. We're currently seeing a situation in the Zaporizhzhia region, not far from Redden. This situation's already a few weeks old, but the video was only just released right now. And you can see pretty clearly here 2 Russian soldiers, one on the left and one on the right, trying to attack a Ukrainian position simultaneously now. Interestingly, this looks like a Russian video at first, but it's actually a Ukrainian video. So like I said, right away, by chance and the quick, decisive reactions of the Ukrainian soldiers, the tide turns and it immediately takes on a different course. than you'd expect. So we see a soldier going in, directly attacking the Ukrainian position, and a second one back here in the corner covering the whole thing. Now we can see either rocks or grenades or whatever being thrown in here, and the Russians then starting to fire at that position. Again, very typical footage that sadly, as we've seen, often ends with the Ukrainians here being executed or shot. Basically, no prisoners are taken. One Russian up close, another a bit further away, and Russians still seem to be on a victory march. They're just about to take the Ukrainian position. They tried shooting in there, but now everything's about to change abruptly, because suddenly, as we can see, the soldier providing cover is no longer shooting in here, but he's noticed, watch out, something's happening, something completely different. They're being attacked from above. The Ukrainians, who'd already been watching the whole thing at the time, the Russians didn't know, managed 10-20 minutes later to bring in their FPV kamikaze drones here and attack, and suddenly the hunters themselves become the hunted, totally taken by surprise. So the ones who just had the upper hand here, who had been trying and thought they were about to clear out the Ukrainian position, are now being hit over and over by various Ukrainian kamikaze drones. And we have to pixel this more and more because in the end, it's actually the case that both Russian soldiers involved here are first wounded and then put on tourniquets. So they're already bleeding heavily and then end up dying because they're hit by more and more Ukrainian drones. This whole thing shows how it's a question of luck and bad luck, of course, but also of strategy, of tactical skill on each side, and in the end, how quickly and unexpectedly the tide can turn in this war, quite literally at any given moment. How quickly winners can turn into losers, and how that seemingly secure, controlled situation of the Russian soldiers can end up allowing the Ukrainians to presumably survive in that position or pull back, and the two Russians who thought they'd pretty much had it made here, but in the end were still killed anyway, despite everything, sadly. Let's look at two more videos together right now about the Russian army's long-range attacks. One of them shows a Shahed 136 attack on Dnipro just yesterday, the million-plus city in the country's far southeastern region. And now we can see the Shahed's approach, which was just filmed, also from a Dnipro channel. And we're about to see the massive explosion at the end. And interestingly, that's what the Russians attacked here, because it's a sunflower oil tank. Yeah, a sunflower oil tank in Ukraine, run by an American firm that has kept exporting the oil from surrounding fields. But apparently for the Russians, this here is also considered a worthwhile military target, that they, well, joking aside, simply want to destroy any kind of infrastructure, any kind of economic capability of Ukraine to bring this country to its knees. And that it's actually this tank that was hit here, as you can see that again in the before and after images. So these two houses here, and we need to remember them right next to the tank. And you can also see those two on the approach. I think you can pretty clearly see here that the two houses we just saw over there are shown from a slightly different perspective. But even if we can't see this tank here, it's basically hidden. And we can say for sure, yes, the Russian army deliberately attacked this sunflower oil tank here, aiming to damage the economy and quite possibly to harm this particular US company and its wider interests as well. We know that in the past few days after Trump's strike on Venezuela, some things between the two countries have shifted again. And in that respect, it's another sign of that, how the Russians are operating to harm Ukraine. And these Shahed drones we just saw, they come in more and more variations in ever more different shapes and sizes too. And one variant of it has just shown up. For the first time, the Ukrainians apparently brought a drone down using electronic warfare, effectively forcing it out of the sky and causing it to crash. Forced a controlled crash. The drone is mostly undamaged. And what was found on that drone is pretty unbelievable, namely a 9K333. Manpads, a shoulder-fired air defense system of the Verba type, that's the Russian name for it, which was basically built onto that Shahed. So that Shahed is, at least theoretically, this is the first time we've seen it, which means we're in an early phase of Russian trials for, in theory, being capable of effectively fending off Ukrainian planes or helicopters. We've seen in recent months not only interceptor drones or ground systems, but often Mi-24, Mi-8, F-16, and sometimes Mirage 2000 aircraft were used to fight these drones. And now it looks like these drones could, as we can see here in more detail, at least in theory. Whether that actually works in practice, that's the next question. You can also see a lot of gaffer tape holding it together, suggesting these drones can defend themselves, and defenders who try to pull them from the sky often have considerable difficulty doing so. Might be very surprised to find that suddenly a very modern anti-aircraft gun is basically pointed at them. And so, as we already said, the hunter becomes the hunted. Yeah, the Mi-8, for example, which moments before considered shooting down this loitering drone, that it then gets attacked by this loitering drone. The whole thing, of course, shows us how the evolution of these big about 4.70 meter long drones is taking place. Just the other day, we already had an R-60 air-to-air missile mounted on it. This drone crashed too, so you can really see that the Russians are still actively testing new systems. However, you can safely assume that if such drones were ever used against Poland or Germany, they'd very likely have the range to reach their targets. Thank God the political situation isn't like that right now, otherwise we can expect it wouldn't just be attack drones, but that very modern, dangerous weapons for the respective defenders would be fired into the countries along with them, potentially posing an even greater threat to civilians and critical infrastructure.